We are now 3 days out from the election. There's a mad scramble, of course, in Washington for people to get positions of power in the new administration. Some of them are good people, some of them are not. You are being widely discussed as potentially the next National Security Advisor or Secretary of Defense taking over DOD. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm fairly confident you can play a large and meaningful role in this administration. You're never going to say any of that, but I thought that the audience might like some context for why we're having this conversation. I think you're one of the very few people with deep experience in national security who share the president's priorities of national security, which is amazing. Not too many, I would say, either of them. There's the context. What does this next administration need to do in order to remain true to the president-elect's articulated positions on war and peace?
Well, thank you, Tucker, and thank you very much, first off, for your confidence in me. It means a great deal. I don't make
heartfelt.
I know, and that's why I'm deeply grateful and honored. And I clearly don't make any presumptions about any role for myself. But what I would say, and I mean this with all sincerity, is that I think the President of the United States, President-elect, is exactly right, that we stand on the possible precipice of World War III, and we need a fundamental change before we run right into the iceberg. I mean, I think the election is over, but this remains absolutely true, is that what I call the liberal primacist alliance, basically the kind of policies of President Biden and Vice President Harris aligned with the primacists, I call them, we could have called them the neoconservatives, have led us to a situation in which we're overextended, we're on the brink of war in multiple theaters, and we could lose them. And I really want peace. And more importantly, President Trump ran to his historic credit on an agenda, as he said on his sort of victory speech, I don't start wars, I end them. Now, I think my view is that we have to have, how you actually get to peace is a difficult question, and I had the honor of being on your show a few years ago when my book came out, and I remember, I don't know if you recall, but I said I was thinking about your question to President Trump about why is it worth defending allies. And I gave that a lot of thought, and that, in a sense, my book is a response to that question, and I think you do need strength, you do. But you need peace through strength, but that term has become cheapened and distorted to become basically an excuse for an aggressive expansionist approach to foreign policy. But I think it's real meaning, and President Trump is in a sense going back to the great tradition of the Republican Party, the Weinberger Doctrine, the Powell Doctrine.
Yes.
Nixon, Eisenhower, as Bob Dole used to put it, these are Democrat wars. It used to be Democrats that started wars and Republicans that ended or avoided them. Eisenhower didn't go into Vietnam in 1954. He did not intervene in Hungary in 1956. Again, nobody thought he was a weak guy. So what needs to happen right now?
Before you get into that, I just think it might be helpful to describe where we are now, because a lot of Americans, I'm in this category, were so absorbed in the election that we may have lost touch with what you opened your remarks by noting, which is we're on the brink of war in multiple theaters. Can you tell us where we are?
Absolutely. Well, I think for the first time in about basically 150 years, we are not clearly the world's largest economy. We compete for that with China, and they are a far larger industrial power. Russia, in purchasing power parity terms, is a very large economy with enormous industrial production capacity. So North Korea advancing its nuclear missile program.
So Russia is a larger manufacturing economy than a lot of us appreciated, I think.
Yeah, I mean, despite a lot of boasting, they're still outproducing the North Atlantic Alliance, including the United States, in artillery production, which is old technology, by like a factor of 2 or 3. Iran's 2 weeks from a nuclear weapon, according to Tony Blinken. And worse, these actors have come together. Now, you will hear from the sort of primacists and liberals that means that we have to fight them all at the same time. No, to the contrary, it means they are collaborating together precisely to tie us down and deplete us. And that's what's happened in the war in Ukraine, where we have expended a tremendous amount of weapons, ditto in places like attacking the Houthis and so forth. At the same time, our defense industrial base has wildly atrophied from where it was 30 years ago, and this is why the agenda for reindustrialization is so important. But that's going to take a long time, as Senator Vance has pointed out. Meantime, China.
Wait, so can I say it's not, I thought one of the justifications, the main justification for this wildly inflated Ukraine funding was that it was going to help reestablish America's
Didn't happen.
industrial base.
And in fact, one of the most kind of oft-used arguments by a lot of the advocates for the war in Ukraine was that we would sort of degrade the Russian military for a song and restore our defense industrial base at the same time. Actually, more or less the reverse has happened. The Russian military is larger, and this is, General Cavoli, the SAC Bureau, has admitted this. The Russian military is larger. It's battle-hardened. I mean, our military has not fought a peer adversary, well, I mean, really since World War II, but certainly since Vietnam and Korea. The Russians have gone toe-to-toe with the Ukrainians, who are capable, and they have a revved-up defense industry at the same time. So in a sense, we're worse. Meantime, the Europeans have basically been asleep at the switch, not going through with their defense buildup, with a few noble exceptions like Poland. So, and then you look at China, which is by far the most formidable challenger, 10 times the GDP of Russia. This administration, Tony Blinken has said, Xi Jinping has given the instructions to their military to be ready for a war over Taiwan by 2027. Frank Kendall, the Secretary of the Air Force in the Biden administration, said the other day that he thinks the Chinese military will say they're ready. We have to be ready for this. My view is we desperately want peace. The Chinese are going to look at us both in terms of our strength, but also in terms of our political commitments. And this is where I think President Trump has been exactly right, which is being willing to talk to President Xi Jinping, not insulting President Xi Jinping and President Putin and others unnecessarily, not supporting things like Taiwan independence, and at the same time being prepared to be strong. And this is where I think if we appoint or if people are put into positions of power who think that we can walk and chew gum and do everything and start wars in 3 different theaters at the same time, not only will that be bad like it was in the Iraq War, and often the same people, it will be far more catastrophic. Tucker, I don't think this is an exaggeration. I think we stand on the precipice of losing a major power war for the first time in our history. So people need to know what time it is, and that really requires focusing on China with the purpose of peace, like we did in the Cold War, which was to say, we're going to be strong, we're not going to go over the line like Eisenhower did in 1950. He's not going to go into Hungary, we're not going to go to Czechoslovakia in 1968, but don't come across our line because you see it's not going to succeed for you. So I think we really stand at a crossroads, and I think President Trump has a mandate for peace. So don't, I just, as an American, whatever happens to me, I so hope that we don't end up with the same failed recipe of starting wars all over the place or getting enmeshed in conflicts when we can't afford to do so, and they're not in the interest of the American people.
From a non-expert position, which is my position, just as someone who's watching, kind of, there does seem to be broad recognition that whatever our objectives in Ukraine were, we didn't achieve them and we can't. Zelensky immediately comes out upon Trump's election and says, actually, I'm for peace. That does maybe seem like it's winding down. Who knows?
I hope. Yeah.
But the noises are consistent with winding down.
Yeah.
So, but at the same time, the very people who are pushing that war all of a sudden like very excited about a war with Iran.
Yeah.
It's like they just seamlessly move. It's like, oh, Ukraine, whatever. Actually, the real problem is Iran, and telling us that Iran's trying to murder President Trump, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know what's true. I don't. But how would the United States, what would happen if we went to war with Iran?
Well, I mean, I think, look, Iran's a bad regime. We don't want to have a nuclear weapon. We don't want to support Israel. We don't want to be able to support groups attacking Israel, et cetera, et cetera. But like, haven't we learned the lesson over the last 25 years about the ill-advised nature of very significant conflicts in the Middle East that don't have clear goals and clear connection to American interests? Like, haven't we been over? Like, didn't we run this experiment a couple times? And it's often the exact same people calling for war with Iran who were involved in the past. And it's like, shouldn't there be some degree of accountability? Moreover, it's like a bad idea in itself. I mean, like I was criticized in The Bulwark by Eric Edelman, who was Dick Cheney's advisor and number 3 at the Pentagon under Bush. He said my ideas were iconoclastic. And I was like, thank you. I'm delighted that you think my ideas are iconoclastic.
So how could Eric Edelman be writing with any credibility at all on foreign policy questions after being intimately involved in the Iraq War and then never apologizing? I don't know. There should be some international authority that requires contrition, like a moral UN, where you don't get to say another word until you don ashes and sackcloth and apologize.
I mean, who among us isn't? I'm certainly not inerrant. I'm certainly not infallible. But like, at least show some. It's like Paul Gigot of the Wall Street Journal a year ago gave a speech to AEI, treated the Iraq War as like a mulligan. It's like I think that's like a big deal. And obviously, a lot of people got to had different views, etc. But it's like it's kind of show the contrition, show the penance, show the learning. And so that I think is the other thing though, Tucker, is like it's the same people who are calling for attacking Iran who are also calling for escalating the war in Ukraine or even a no-fly zone, recognizing an independent Taiwan, or getting in a war with China, or attacking North Korea. It's like if we do all those things, we know objectively as a fact that our military is not capable of fighting more than one major war at a time. So even if you did want to, getting in multiple fights with people at the same time is just like foolhardy. And I mean, but the way I think about it is the Washington blob establishment can get us into wars and crises, but they can't fix the problem. So it's really important right now. And it seems to me that, just listening to President Trump and his historic victory, the decisive mandate he got, his leadership, his mandate, his agenda for peace from a position of strength, use the military sparingly but have it be strong. It's really important not to get enmeshed all over the place and either bleed ourselves out or a catastrophic multi-front loss.
I think that's the last thing Donald Trump wants.
It certainly seems that way.
Right. I mean, the arc of his life is so remarkable. The redemption that we just saw on Tuesday, without precedent really in American history. And so, if you wanted to destroy his presidency, his second presidency, what's the one foolproof way to destroy it?
No president has ever lost a great power war. Donald Trump has run to his enormous historic credit. He has been shot. He has had lawfare conducted against him, and he has had the bravery and the vision and the persistence and the commitment at great personal physical cost, but also to his reputation, his family, etc., to stand up for these principles that the United States desperately needs, putting Americans' interests first, peace, prosperity, etc., reindustrialization. Now is the time to put that into practice, whoever it is. I can't stress how important that is. And if you're thinking about a historical legacy, Joe Biden's going to leave a legacy that's terrible. I mean, for all the things, you mentioned the war in Ukraine. 2.5 years in, Julian Barnes' New York Times just reported that the intelligence community is reporting that the Ukrainians are losing, that it's not a stalemate. So after all that, after all the preaching, after all the moralism, the Ukrainians are losing the war and the Russians are making enormous progress. And we're unprepared. We're unprepared for a war with China. The Middle East is in the worst situation in years. We can't even stop the Houthis, like a third or fourth rate power. And we're not prepared. So they've left us on the precipice. They've put us on the Titanic is directing towards the iceberg. It's going to take a sharp turn. And the way I think about this, and when I had the honor to work for President Trump in his first term, when we worked on the defense strategy to try to get us to prioritize, again, in my view, with the same logic, very consistent with what President Trump, I think, was trying to lay out. That was like, we were a couple miles from the iceberg back then. Now we're like right up, we're a few thousand yards. And it's not easy to turn the Titanic. And if you turn the Titanic 90 degrees, people are going to fall out of their bunks. Chandeliers and beautiful plates are going to get broken. But that's where we are. But that is the fault of what I call the liberal primacist alliance. That is the fault of Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and the primacist, sort of old school Republicans who, if they pursued that policy further, would lead us to catastrophe.
Then how is it that, from what I can tell, pretty much every person in the running for the big national security jobs other than you is part of that alliance? And I know them all, and I like some of them. A couple sitting U.S. senators who I think are really nice guys. But they're tools of the people you describe, like completely. There's kind of no doubt about it. How is it that there are so few people on the Republican side in national security with experience who agree with the president-elect who leads the party?
So I've thought a lot about this because I've been fighting, as you kindly gesture, a sort of a lonely battle within the sort of blob to put us on, like, to me, what is common sense.
Exactly.
Right?
That's right.
And yet, so few people do it. And why is that? It's so weird. And honestly, so much of your insight and commentaries, both on this show and your other podcast interviews, and your shows, etc., because I think there's a human sociological element. I mean, not to get, and one of the things that's kind of bizarre is that I think, like, today, people like us, we can learn a lot from the new left of the 60s and 70s. Like, there's something wrong with the establishment and the way the establishment. Now, I believe there's always an establishment. There's an establishment in Mao's China. But we need a better establishment.
Well, that's it.
You're a fan of Teddy Roosevelt, too. Like, the idea that, like, the establishment just does what it used to do is like, no, the point is the establishment is supposed to serve the people, right?
Of course.
But I think there's an element, and I try to give credit because, like, yeah, there's money and stuff, but there's other ways of making money. I think it's this psychic kind of like network benefit of being part of like essentially functionally an imperial capital.
Yes.
And everybody comes to, you know this, right? They come to the capital and say, you're so wise, we need your leadership, you're so moral in your vision. And it happens in Congress where people come, they've probably not thought about foreign policy that much. There are all these structures set up to kind of acculturate them. And again, like, I don't want to sound too new left, but like, this is kind of what happens. And so you need, I think, a clear-eyed view of how to change it, and frankly, a willingness to buck the system. And this, to me, is like, and I'm certainly far from the only person to make this point. I think you have as well. It's like President Trump ran against the system, and that is so important because it's the system, the liberal primacist alliance, in other things like trade and economics, etc., that need to be a fundamental change. And already he's paid the price, literally, and shown the bravery and commitment to go through that. And so now it's about, like, capitalizing. And frankly, my hope is if that happened, a lot of these people, especially in the younger generations, would follow. And forgive me for a little bit of patting myself on the back, but I think it's an apropos comment. I was out at a thing a few months ago, and this young guy came up, strong guy, whatever, and he said, hey, Mr. Colby, I'm going in the Marines, and I just want to say all the young Republicans love what you're saying. And I said to him, I was like, well, that's good, because all the old Republicans hate it. And he's like, yeah, that's the point.
Boy, do they. Boy,
right?
do they.
They do that. And that's like, to me, I think of myself, I'm like the first line, not to, this is, although, there are people out there you wonder about, but like, this is not like actually getting shot. But it's like, I'm trying to think about how do we protect Americans from not getting shot? Of course. Right? And so I think the young people can see it. The young people who are like, who are not bought in to, who have not been kind of acculturated, worked for ex-senator on this committee for 10 years and then went to that think tank and blah, blah, blah. I think they if you build it, they will come. But it's like the first echelon. we take a lot of metaphorical flack, hopefully metaphorical.
I won't go on about this, but I am a little bit distressed by it, very distressed by it. But like someone like Mike Pompeo, I'll just say the name, who I don't think is going to get a job in this administration. I would pray that he's not. I think he's a criminal. I've said that. Plotted to murder someone who hadn't even been charged with a crime. That's a criminal act. Should be arrested for that. That's my view. But even if you don't believe that, he's been anti-Trump for 8 years, worked against Trump, and he's a crazed neocon. And he's still being talked about and promoted. Again, I don't think he's going to get the job, but promoted to run the national security establishment in the United States. How can that even happen?
Well, look, I mean, I think it's if I were advising President Trump, I would say, especially now that the mandate has happened,
yes,
why pick anybody who's not aligned with what you're trying to do? I mean, I saw the last ad that President Trump ran. I mean, it was a stirring ad, and it won. Who was in that ad? You, Tulsi Gabbard, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Vivek, and Vice President-elect Vance. That is the mandate, So like, my hope is that he will own that, and that's the way for peace. And there's going to be debates about various policies and how to emphasize this or that. But why go back, especially in a situation where, as successful as the first term is, the situation that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are leaving President Trump in January is, I cannot stress how dangerous it is. And he's right. I mean, the way that President Trump, again, has commendably talked about the risk of nuclear war. I worked on nuclear issues a lot. My kind of starting point a lot was like working on nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy and arms control. I worked on arms control with the Russians. We should be afraid of these things. A salutary fear, not like an unmanning fear, if you will.
Right.
But like a salutary fear. The beginning of wisdom is fear, or whatever the Bible says to that effect. I should know that, but
it's true.
Is true, right? Is understanding and calibrating. And to me, one of the like touched grass kind of things about a lot of the people who are calling for like no-fly zones over Ukraine and intervening against the Russians and escalating and allowing U.S. weapons to be overtly used to attack Moscow and Russian strategic, forces sites, like that is obviously crazy. It's like, time out. Like, that is obviously...
There are many Republicans.
Yes. In fact, some of the... That's why I think that the arguments within the Republican Party in some ways are fiercer, because my hope, Tucker, and I think this is something you've been, on for a while, but it's like the Democrats are like, they're sort of inherently out of position right now. Like, where is the left? Where are the people who are like anti-war? Where are the people who say the CIA is not above reproach or the FBI is not above reproach? Who are the people, Wright Mills or whatever, the power elite and all this stuff? Those people, those movements have to come back. And I think that that's something where, especially given the mandate that President Trump has won, that whatever you think of Bernie Sanders, the fact that he said like we're out of position. And others are saying they're out of position. My hope is that Democrats will go back, in a sense, to the kind of arguments that I'm making that I think you could have heard a Democrat make 10 minutes ago,
right,
or 30 years ago, or 40 years ago. Hey, we've got to be able to talk to our opponents. We have to have a strong military, but not get into unnecessary wars. That's just common sense.
That's for sure.
Do you remember when Democrats used to refer to abortion as something that should be safe, legal, and rare? Well, they've changed their view on that. It went from a right to a sacrament. This isn't the pro-choice movement you may remember from 30 years ago. This is something much darker. And that's why we have joined forces with Preborn. They're a sponsor of the show and of our speaking tour, to do something about it. It's the largest pro-life organization in the United States. And they are doing what they should do, which is speaking up against this atrocity. Killing babies after birth? No one seems to have the bravery to call that wrong, which it is. But Preborn is calling it out. Their networks of clinics are positioned in the highest abortion areas in the country, and they've rescued 300,000 babies. When a woman considering an abortion searches to end her baby's life, Preborn is there. The power of ultrasound, combined with the love of God, doubles the baby's chance of being born. A single ultrasound costs $28. 5 ultrasounds are $140. Giving women the information they need to make the decision that many of them actually want to make, to have a baby. Any gift will help, and all gifts are tax deductible. To donate securely, go to preborn.com/Tucker or call pound 250 on your phone, and when asked, use the word baby.
You mentioned CIA. Now is probably a good time to address it. Your last name is Colby. That is familiar. That's a familiar name to anyone who knows the history of the Central Intelligence Agency. Your grandfather ran it, William Colby. And there are two interesting things. One is, I'm sure this will set off just explosions of theorizing on the internet. So what is your view of CIA? I think that's why your family's in Washington, because you're...
Yeah, well, actually, my great-grandfather was a career Army officer, so I come from a kind of a national security, background. My dad, not so much, but look, my view on the intelligence community, and I worked on this stuff myself when I was kind of early in my career, although on the commission that looked at why Iraq intelligence is wrong. I didn't agree with my grandfather for everything. I didn't know him super well. I mean, I know a lot about how he approached things and how he, his record and so forth. One thing where I do really agree with him, and where his legal training, and the fact that actually, as Jim Schlesinger said, he was the first liberal to become director of Central Intelligence, was that he thought, and I agree with him, that you need a CIA. You need a national security establishment, but it's not above reproach, and it needs to be accountable. And that's what the interesting thing about him, just to stress that I don't take any credit for it, like I'm just telling you just because he asked me. He was in World War II. He was then a field guy. He was in Europe, and then he was in Vietnam for a long time. And then he kind of ended up as director by happenstance, as these things sometimes do, during Watergate. And so he had not been really involved. He wasn't one of the inside club of so you got Dick Helm's book, The Man Who Kept the Secrets. He was the kind of ultimate insider, Washington operator kind of. My grandfather was out, unlike me. I'm more of a DC type, policy type, But I think he came in and he said, there's a chance that, remember this, the Democrats at the time, the congressional class of 1974, very left-wing, a lot of them were thinking, let's just get rid of this place. Let's get rid of the intelligence. Right. And his view is like, that's not good for our country, but it's not good that they're spying on Americans. I got in debates on some of these on Twitter sometimes about like whether the American government is funding some of the stuff, in Europe or whatever, or NATO, blah, 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 that's reverberating back to the American political system. It's like, yeah, it's happened before, right?
For a long time.
For a long time. So it's like, it's not unreasonable. And by the way, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And by the way, who were some of the people who were opposed at that time? Dick Cheney, Don Rumsfeld. They were opposed to any kind of Henry Kissinger, any kind of accountability for the intelligence community. And so that's how I look at it. I think there's a real need for accountability. Also in the professional military. What is this going on with 4-star officers recently retired who have no political vetting? They haven't been elected dog catcher, weighing in on extremely sensitive points on American calling one of the presidential candidates a fascist. That is wildly inappropriate. There needs to be a fundamental change. First of all, it's wrong. Second of all, it's not consistent with our constitutional order. Remember that our founding fathers, who had gone through the revolution, who had fought a war against a great power and won, they were like, the nasty politics is a feature. Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson talking about each other's mother, fine. Standing military, We only built a serious standing military. American military officers wore civilian clothes into the Pentagon as late as World War II, maybe even after. So we have come, this is since 1947, or since World War II, basically, and I think we need it, given what's happening, but it needs to be accountable. The third point I would make about this group is, like, where do they get off? Like, has our military been successful? Have our political military goals been achieved over the last 25 years? You know,
well, call me when you win a war.
Yeah,
no, I agree.
If you're Dwight Eisenhower, and by the way, that's most of that guilt goes towards the liberal primacist alliance, the politicians who did it, yes, but also the war leaders who, you know, for instance, H.R. McMaster wrote a book called Dereliction of Duty about how the generals in Vietnam did not tell Lyndon Johnson they couldn't successfully prosecute that war. Okay, I agree with you. How is the senior military done? So I think some humility, getting back to basics, and staying out of politics is really needed.
It's infuriating. It does challenge, like, the idea of our constitutional order. I agree completely, but it's also ominous. So when you read that the Pentagon now has a new policy where the direction of civilian leadership, they can kill Americans in the United States, what is that?
I mean, look, there's a lot of things that need to be taken a look at where, like, we have gotten, especially after 9/11, where it's just metastasized, right? Where we need to ask ourselves, what is the right? And I think you've done this, like, commendably, where you're saying, look, you know, I was here on this position here, and I'm same thing. Where, like, you know, but look at the costs. And people, like, you know, who were, we would say, on the old new left, who would have said, oh my God, this is going to be abused, and people like us were like, don't worry about it. And now they were right. So let's take a new look at that. Again, I think we need to have the capabilities, but I also think this is where this group, I mean, practically speaking, not only former CIA leaders implying that President Trump was a Russian agent is a wild abuse of the trust, because it's a special trust with classified information and special agencies. And it's almost like a religious obligation where there needs to be a self-discipline and an understanding that there's certain things you can't do, you know? And that's been deeply violated. And I think, frankly, Republicans agree that. A lot of Democrats or independents or whatever voted for President Trump. They've delivered a verdict on this issue. So I think you need people who have that balance, which to me is the American way, is to say, look, the people have spoken. This stuff got out of hand. And we need to have a balance, but we need to preserve what we need for our security.
What do you do in Ukraine?
Well, one is I hope the president is successful and leans forward on his plan to end the war. And I just say, I don't know what that is, but nobody knew what Dwight Eisenhower was talking about in 1952. Nobody knew what Richard Nixon was talking about in 1968. And nobody knew what Ronald Reagan was talking about in 1988. You already see indications that players, including President Putin, might be changing, and the Ukrainians for that matter. So I hope there's a basis. What exactly that looks like, I don't think it, you know, you're not going to, like, liberate Crimea, right? That's obvious. And the war's not going well. I think that's step one. And I think the Europeans need to, I mean, this is something I've been banging on. It's just so common sense. And by the way, you want to talk about who's helping. Biden and Harris, you know, would go to Europe and say, you don't need to worry about anything. But so would kind of primacist type Republicans. They would go to Europe and say, don't worry, we can do everything. We're leading. They didn't do the Europeans any favors. They didn't do the Ukrainians any favors, let alone, you know, anybody else, let alone the American people, because they promised things they couldn't deliver. And this is something where, you know, and I said this, I was, Ross Douthat, we had an interview right before the election in the New York Times, you know, where I get, isn't it, you know, Ross didn't say this, but it was sort of like questioning the morality of what President Trump's saying. I don't think there's been a stronger case, a more important time for a foreign policy that is more moral than what you see, which is the moralism, which is all intention. You see it on the left from Tony Blinken, just saying, the Ukrainians are fighting for freedom, so we need to do X, Y, Z, and then failing. The way I think about it is like, no, we need a foreign policy that's more like, how does a parent think about the responsibility of the child?
Exactly.
Or let's say you're on the board of an orphanage. You know, you might have a really good guy. He goes to church every Sunday. He's like, you know, never cheats at cards or whatever, but he sucks at handling the money. No, you're going to hire a guy who's actually going to take care of the orphans.
Exactly.
And that is,
well, by the way, if all the orphans die, it doesn't matter how much you love them.
Exactly.
Or claim that you do.
You don't actually love them.
Well, of course you don't, because the purpose of a system is its effect. And what's the effect of the war in Ukraine is to depopulate Ukraine, and now to allow foreigners, including many Americans, including BlackRock, to buy the soil of Ukraine.
I mean, it's certainly not, whatever this has happened has definitely not been beneficial.
Well, the Ukrainians just lost Ukraine, but not to the Russians, but through the encouragement of the Biden administration. That's my view of it. But how close do you think we have come to a nuclear exchange with Russia during the last?
I think it's close. I mean, and Woodward, I mean, I'm not sure how reliable he is on everything, but I think the reporting that the Biden administration, which was against interest, was very worried about Russian nuclear employment in later 2022 is very, very concerning. I think it was quite real. And the people who are blithe and insouciant about it, I think, is incredibly irresponsible and should not be near serious decisions.
Who are those people?
Well, I think you see this kind of liberal premises. There's a lot of people who signed the no-fly zone or who made comments on Twitter or otherwise around that time and have said, oh, lift all the restrictions on the employment of U.S. forces. And by the way, what's very clear is a lot of these people, if given the opportunity, if they thought the political environment would bear it, would support direct intervention, which if we go to war with the Russians directly, the Russians are very prepared to use nuclear weapons, so we have to be realistic about what that entails.
What does that entail?
Well, I mean, I think the Russians, one thing about Putin that's important, and again, like, you don't have to like the person to understand that we need to take this guy seriously, right? Is he, as he assumed power and took over from Yeltsin, which in the Russian mind was a catastrophically disastrous period, one of the first things Putin invested in was the recapitalization of the Russian nuclear forces. And the way Putin talks about Russian nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy indicates that he has a quite sophisticated understanding of nuclear strategy. Of course, a lot of speculation, because thank God they've only been used once or twice. But it says to me this guy's credible, and he has an idea of how to use them. You don't start by blowing up Washington, D.C. You start potentially with something like battlefield use, selective strikes against things like places in Europe or more peripheral targets, but it can go up there, and then you manipulate risk. And if weapons are used in that way, you can see millions of people. I mean, and we have almost no defense against. That's why I think President Trump, for instance, like having a better shield would be great. But right now, we're pretty much denuded.
I just don't understand. I mean, I guess it's kind of late in the game to whine about it, but we provided, a missile defense shield to another country, but we don't have one. Like, how did that happen?
I don't know. I mean, I think that's something that we can work on. I mean, it's technically very difficult, but I think having something better than what we have now.
But we're always bragging about, the sophisticated use of our defensive missile technology abroad.
Yeah.
Like, did it occur to nobody that the purpose of the U.S. military is to defend the United States?
Well, it is. And by the way, up until the ABM treaty was signed in the late 60s, you would go around American cities and there would be Nike Ajax and Nike Hercules nuclear-tipped missile defense interceptors and other kinds, NORAD and all these kinds of things. So I think having a stronger defense of the American homeland makes sense. And also, like, people talk about the American military being used in relation to Mexico. It's like, well, I think Mexico is like and the immigration issue is very, very complicated and everything, but like, the American military is to defend the United States, right? So like that should be, so to me, the core missions of the American military that really need to be focused on is defense of the homeland, preventing China from becoming the hegemonic power in Asia, because I think we'll never reindustrialize, we'll never be autonomous and be what America needs to be if China dominates Asia. But I hope and think we can do that without a war, working with others that pull their own weight. And then having an ability to make sure that we don't have a replication of 9/11. Now, some of that is like being smarter about how we use our own military, but I think some of it is you got to keep tabs out there. And then I think it's like about supporting. People say Trump is anti-ally. I think that's totally wrong. It's just a different model of allies that's obviously A, is much closer to the Cold War model, and B, is common sense, is like partnership.
They say Trump is anti-ally, so our, of course, most important ally in Europe is Germany.
Yes, which is Germany. Totally...
and we just destroyed... And so, but by the way, we had a direct hand, this is not speculation, I'm willing to say it's fact, in blowing up Nord Stream. So I know we're blaming the Ukrainians, but like, we did that. I'm just going to say that. No, that's not true. It is true. So how exactly do we get to launch an act of industrial terrorism against our closest NATO ally? How is that allyship?
Well, the thing that's weird, and this gets, I think, also into the context of like who benefits, cui bono, right?
Yeah.
Is like, so since the Ukraine war broke out, the European economy, and particularly the German economy, has been like in free fall. So there was this kind of cute argument for a while that we had somehow like benefited from Europe sucking air after the Ukraine
I've
war
heard many
broke out.
people say that.
And it's like, well, no, wait, hold on. Our point, if you go back to like Dwight
I know.
Eisenhower and like common sense, is like, no, we want them to stand on our 2 feet. Like, I don't get a rise out of lording it over the Europeans. This is sort of this mindset that like.
Well, this is still fundamentally a European country. This was a European colony. So Europe is basically allied with the United States on a very fundamental level, or certainly has been for 250 years. So destroying Europe, well, right, with some exceptions. But in general.
You fight with the people closest to you.
Well,
you know
that's
what I mean?
right.
Yeah,
but
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
like, Christian Europe, right? It's basically our ally. And destroying Western Europe, which I think we've done, how does that help us?
Well,
I don't understand.
I don't think that it's. I mean, the interesting thing about that is, I mean, obviously we're, settled, originally by Europeans. Now we have people coming from all over the world, et cetera. But the thing is, actually, if you look back at our early history, we stayed out of Europe.
Oh, I know.
And we were actually more involved in the Western Hemisphere, particularly the Caribbean.